The shove didn't look like much at first. It came fast, almost careless, the kind of cheap push people throw when they want to look tough without risking a real fight. Most of the crowd had their backs turned, focused on the food table or trying to keep kids from running into the street, so only a few people saw it happen. But those who did caught the whole thing from start to finish. Two men drifting around the edge of the barbecue, acting bored, pretending they belonged there even though no one recognized them. One of them nudged the other, nodded toward the woman standing near the grill, and smirked in a way that told everyone everything they needed to know. She had been minding her own business. Not talking, not looking for trouble, just standing in a spot that was a little too convenient for a couple of guys who were already restless. Maybe they thought she looked quiet enough to ignore them. Maybe they wanted to show off for each other. Maybe they were stirred up by something earlier in the day and figured they could let it spill out here. The reason didn't matter. What mattered was the way he stepped behind her as if he owned the place, lifted his hand, set it on her back for half a second, and then shoved. People nearby gasped the moment he made contact. Not because it was violent, but because it was disrespectful in a way that didn't fit the afternoon. Kids were eating popsicles. Someone was handing out plates of ribs. Music was playing low from a speaker near the fence. It wasn't a place for anyone to start something. The push broke the mood, cutting through the relaxed chatter like someone snapping a stick next to your ear. Her body moved forward an inch, maybe two. Just enough to show she had been pushed. Not enough to knock her off balance. It wasn't the reaction the men expected. The one who shoved her straightened up, waiting for her to stumble. She didn't. She didn't even flinch. Her feet stayed planted. Her posture held steady, as if someone had brushed past her in a grocery aisle. For a moment, she didn't turn around. She didn't speak. She only breathed in once through her nose, slow and controlled, the kind of breath people take when they're deciding what comes next. A few feet away, a group of neighbors stopped their conversation mid-sentence. One woman set down her lemonade. A man holding a tray of burgers paused without realizing the grease was sliding off the spatula. You could see the shift move across the yard like a quiet ripple. People sensed something had changed. They weren't sure what, but they knew it involved the push. The men didn't notice any of this. They were too busy enjoying themselves. The one who shoved her looked around with that proud little grin people get when they think they've just done something funny. His friend punched him lightly on the shoulder, the kind of gesture that says "good job, man," as if the moment deserved applause. They were waiting for a reaction from her. Maybe anger, maybe fear, maybe a few shaky words. What they got instead was silence. She finally lifted her head a little, just enough for a few strands of hair to shift off her cheek. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. There was no rush in her movement. If anything, she looked patient, almost bored, the way someone looks when they've been interrupted in the middle of something routine. Her calm unsettled the few people watching. They weren't used to seeing anyone absorb a shove like that without even turning around. More neighbors began to pick up on the tension. A father carrying a cooler slowed as he walked past. A teenage girl paused her music and pulled out one earbud. A couple setting out lawn chairs looked at each other, unsure if they should keep unfolding them. Everyone's attention pulled slowly toward the woman who had been pushed, not because they expected a fight, but because the air around her felt charged in a way that told them this wasn't going to be brushed off. The men still didn't get it. They started whispering to each other, snickering under their breath as if they were the only ones in on a joke. The one who shoved her shifted his weight, tapping his foot in a restless, jumpy rhythm. He kept glancing at her back, waiting for her to react, waiting for signs that he had unsettled her. But she stood there steady as a pole planted deep in the ground. Then, very slowly, she turned her head. Not her whole body, just her head, as if she wanted to make sure she saw their faces before anything else. Her eyes settled on them, calm, level, and without a hint of fear. The shift was so small that half the crowd didn't even notice it. But the ones who did felt something tighten in their chest. It was the moment right before someone finds out they made a mistake they can't pull back from. Her reaction didn't match what anyone expected. People thought she might spin around, raise her voice, shove back, or at least show a flash of irritation. Instead, she moved in a way that barely counted as a reaction at all. It was calm, almost casual, like she'd been nudged by someone trying to get through a crowded hallway. Her shoulders stayed loose. Her jaw didn't tighten. She didn't huff or mutter anything under her breath. It was the sort of response that made you look twice, because no one handles a surprise shove like that unless they've trained themselves to stay collected under pressure. The stillness around her grew noticeable. The way she breathed gave it away first. It was steady, controlled, the kind of rhythm that doesn't break even when something unexpected happens. You could see her chest rise slowly, then fall, as if she were resetting her focus. There was nothing defensive about it. It was almost mindful, like she had taken that breath 1,000 times before during moments when losing control simply wasn't an option. Her hands didn't tremble. Her balance stayed centered. Her stance looked grounded enough to withstand anything heavier than a careless push. Even her fingers stayed relaxed at her sides. Most people's hands curl into fists when they get startled or disrespected, but hers didn't shift at all. It was the sort of subtle detail only a few noticed, mostly the neighbors closest to her, but it set the tone for what followed. The men who pushed her didn't understand what they were seeing. They thought her quiet reaction meant she was intimidated. They assumed the lack of drama meant they had caught her off guard. But the neighbors who had spent more time around her saw something else. They recognized the way she stayed aware without stiffening. They saw how she kept her weight evenly distributed across her feet. They noticed the faint change in her posture, a shift so small it felt like watching someone adjust a picture frame by a fraction of an inch. Her head turned just enough for her to see them from the corner of her eye. She didn't rush. There was no snap or sudden twist, nothing that could be mistaken for emotional impulse. Her movements were slow and exact, the kind of pace that tells you the person isn't reacting on instinct. They're assessing, measuring, taking in every detail before deciding what needs to happen. Around her, the crowd's chatter faded in uneven pockets. People weren't quiet because they expected a confrontation. They were quiet because her calmness felt unusual, and unusual behavior always pulls attention. A boy stopped dragging his plastic sword through the grass. A woman holding a plate of cornbread turned her wrist slightly, not wanting to spill anything while she watched. A group of teenagers paused mid-laugh, the sound cutting off in a way that made the moment feel sharper. No one could read her expression. It wasn't angry, but it wasn't passive either. Her eyes held a level focus that almost seemed out of place at a neighborhood barbecue. It reminded some people of a lifeguard watching a rough wave, or a firefighter scanning a building before stepping inside. A look that suggested she saw more than everyone else, but wasn't rushed by any of it. She shifted her foot an inch, barely enough to mark a difference, yet somehow it centered her even more. It was the kind of subtle realignment people learn only through repetition. Training often leaves behind these quiet habits, the ones most people would never notice unless they knew what to look for. This was one of those habits. A physical check-in, a quick calibration that showed she had complete control over her space and her reactions. What caught the neighbors most off guard was her lack of fear. Fear shows up in small ways in most people, especially when startled. A tightening around the eyes, a defensive pull of the shoulders, a rushed inhale that pushes the chest too high. She displayed none of that. The calmness wasn't bravado. It wasn't performance. It looked like something practiced over years, maybe decades, until it became second nature. The men who pushed her didn't understand the shift, but the people who knew her, even casually, could sense it. They couldn't name it, but they felt the controlled confidence that radiated off her. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet in a way that demanded attention. She stood there like someone who had been in tense situations before, someone who had learned how to keep her mind clear when things got unpredictable. The moment stretched just long enough for everyone to recognize that her reaction wasn't the absence of action. It was preparation, a slow, steady gathering of awareness that changed the tone of the yard even if no one spoke about it. Her calm confidence made the men look smaller without her ever lifting a hand or raising her voice. It hinted that she wasn't someone who panicked or lost control, even when someone tried to catch her from behind. People began to realize something was different before anyone said a word. It happened in small, scattered moments across the yard, almost like the way people sense a shift in weather before a storm arrives. Someone near the grill raised an eyebrow without meaning to. A neighbor holding a serving spoon froze mid-scoop. A teenager who had been scrolling on her phone lowered it just enough to glance over. The change wasn't dramatic, but it built on itself, one subtle observation at a time. At first, the crowd thought they were reacting to the shove itself. It had been rude and unnecessary, but that alone wouldn't have drawn this much attention. Plenty of people had seen other neighbors lose their temper before, or make a scene for no good reason. What pulled everyone in now wasn't the push, but the woman's response. The calmness she held was so precise it felt practiced, and people didn't usually react like that unless they had a reason. A man who lived 4 houses down noticed her stance first. He had served in the military years ago and recognized the posture. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't defensive. It was something in between, a quiet readiness that showed she understood exactly where everyone was in relation to her. He didn't say anything, but the recognition made him straighten slightly as he watched. A woman near the picnic table tilted her head as she studied the scene. She had always been good at reading people's body language, and the small details caught her eye. The way the woman shifted her weight without looking like she moved. The way she held her shoulders level even after being shoved. The way her eyes stayed sharp and focused rather than confused or startled. These weren't everyday reactions. They were the kinds of responses you see in people who have trained to keep control at all times. More neighbors began to notice the same hints. It was subtle, but once you saw one sign, the rest became clearer. Her breathing was slow and even. Her hands stayed open and relaxed. Her gaze didn't dart around in alarm, but stayed steady and aware. It gave the moment a strange tension, something quiet but unmistakable. People who had been chatting about weekend plans or sports scores let their conversations trail off as their attention drifted toward her. Someone on the patio whispered a question, asking if anyone knew her story. The whisper wasn't loud, but it carried just enough for a couple of others to hear. A second later, another neighbor murmured that she had moved in recently, kept to herself, and never caused trouble. A third person added that she always seemed polite but distant, like she didn't want to draw attention. None of these details explained what they were seeing now, but they pointed to someone who stayed calm on purpose. The men who had shoved her started to lose their earlier confidence. They didn't understand why people were watching. They didn't notice the details the crowd was picking up, but they sensed something shifting against them. Their smirks dropped little by little. Their eyes flicked around the yard, unsure why the atmosphere had changed. They had expected laughter, or at least indifference from the crowd. Instead, they saw neighbors studying the woman with a level of curiosity that bordered on respect. A few older residents exchanged glances, the kind that said they had seen this type of composure somewhere before, but couldn't quite place it. One of them had a son who served in the Navy and recognized the way she carried herself. It wasn't identical, but the tone was familiar. That quiet alertness, that ability to stay centered, that sense that her awareness was wider than what her eyes revealed. She wasn't just standing there. She was assessing. Then something shifted in the crowd's mood. It wasn't spoken, but it felt like a collective understanding forming in pieces. People began to sense that she wasn't merely calm because she was avoiding conflict. She was calm because she knew exactly what she was doing. That difference mattered. It made the moment feel less like a tense misunderstanding and more like a situation in which she had the upper hand without needing to show it. A low wave of recognition spread across faces, though none of them would have been able to describe it clearly. They just felt it. The woman wasn't reacting like an ordinary neighbor caught in an uncomfortable moment. She wasn't startled or intimidated. She wasn't unsure of herself. Her body language had the consistency of training, something drilled long enough to become instinct. The men who shoved her finally noticed the way people were looking at her. They didn't recognize what the crowd saw, but they did sense that the energy had shifted entirely out of their favor. Their earlier bravado thinned. The smirks they wore slipped into uncertainty. They stood a little further apart, no longer acting like a pair feeding off each other's confidence. The attention that had once fed their ego now felt like a weight. The woman still hadn't spoken, but the silence around her said enough. The neighbors watched with a slowly growing understanding that she wasn't someone you shoved from behind. Not because she was dangerous, not in a wild or unpredictable way, but because she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to be announced. Whatever her story was, people sensed now that it was bigger than the small backyard moment unfolding in front of them. It happened so fast that some people weren't sure they saw it correctly. One moment she was standing there, calm and still. The next, she moved with a precision that didn't match the pace of a casual backyard gathering. It didn't look flashy or dramatic. It wasn't the kind of move designed to scare anyone or start a fight. It was clean, controlled, and efficient in a way that made the crowd blink. She didn't lunge. She didn't swing. Instead, she shifted her weight the slightest bit to her left, almost like she was adjusting her footing on uneven ground. That shift placed her out of the direct line of the man closest to her without looking like anything intentional. It created just enough space for her to move without ever appearing aggressive. Then, with a motion so quick it felt like a single breath, she reached back and caught the wrist of the man who had shoved her. There was no force in the grab, no jerk, no attempt to twist him into pain. She simply placed her hand where it needed to be, like she had predicted exactly where his arm would end up before he even moved. The man stiffened, surprised that her hand was suddenly on him. The friend beside him froze too, unsure what he'd just seen. The grip wasn't threatening. If anything, it looked delicate. But it locked the man in place with such quiet confidence that everyone watching could tell he wasn't going anywhere unless she allowed it. She stepped half a pace forward, guiding his wrist with her. Not dragging, guiding. The difference mattered. It was the kind of motion people learn through repetition, where the body knows the exact angle needed to stop someone without hurting them. The man's balance faltered, not because she forced him, but because he had never expected her to move at all, let alone with such skill. He ended up leaning awkwardly forward, his other hand raised slightly as if he could catch himself in a fall that wasn't happening. She spoke quietly then, though most people didn't catch the words. They were short, steady, almost soft. Not a command, not a threat, but something factual. The tone alone was enough to still him. His friend tried to step in, confused and agitated, but she shifted again, just an inch or two, enough to angle her body so she could monitor both of them. She didn't release the first man. She didn't tighten her grip either. She simply maintained control in a way that made it clear she knew exactly what she was doing. The friend hesitated. He wasn't sure how to react. He had expected anger or shouting, something messy that he could either escalate or walk away from. Instead, he faced a woman who had neutralized his buddy with one small, precise movement that didn't look like a fight at all. It looked like she solved a problem. Efficiently, quietly, without breaking a sweat. People around the yard began to understand what they were seeing. The motion had been smooth, like a reflex honed over years. Someone whispered that it looked like a trained maneuver. Another person murmured that it reminded them of something their brother once showed them after returning from service. A few nodded without taking their eyes off her. They sensed the controlled strength in the way she stood, the way she angled her shoulders, the way her stance stayed balanced, even while managing someone else's movement. The man caught in her hold tried to pull free, but it didn't accomplish anything. She didn't fight the tug. She went with it, guiding his motion so he ended up in the exact same position he started in, only more aware now that she had complete control over the situation. The look on his face changed from bravado to confusion, then to something closer to concern. He realized he couldn't overpower her. Worse, he realized he didn't understand how she had controlled him so easily. The crowd watched with a mix of caution and awe. Parents held their kids a little closer, not out of fear of her, but out of uncertainty about the man who had caused the problem in the first place. Several neighbors exchanged looks, wordless but clear. This woman wasn't ordinary. People had suspected she had some type of disciplined background. Now the evidence was unmistakable. Her face didn't shift much during the entire moment. Her expression stayed steady, focused but calm, as if she were handling something routine. That made the whole thing even more striking. She wasn't worked up. She wasn't on edge. She wasn't reacting emotionally. Her body moved with intention, every motion deliberate but restrained. Then she adjusted her stance once more, guiding the man's wrist slightly downward so he had no choice but to bend at the elbow. The movement wasn't forceful. It was simply the logical result of leverage. Suddenly his posture collapsed into compliance. His knees bent slightly. His head dipped. He looked less like someone ready to cause trouble and more like someone who wished he hadn't started anything in the first place. It was then that the rest of the crowd fully grasped the truth about her. They didn't know her whole story yet, but they understood this. Whatever her background was, it had trained her to act decisively, calmly, and with precise control. And she had handled both men without raising her voice, without throwing a punch, and without causing harm. The moment they learned the truth didn't come through a dramatic announcement or a shouted warning. It arrived quietly, almost accidentally, through a few whispered exchanges that rippled across the yard. It started with one neighbor, the kind who notices everything even when she pretends not to. She had seen the woman before, jogging early in the mornings, always with a pace that suggested purpose instead of exercise. She remembered seeing the faint outline of a tattoo on the woman's shoulder once when they passed each other near the mailbox. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, watching the way the woman controlled the man's wrist with calm precision, the memory clicked into place. She muttered something to the man beside her, and he frowned at first, then nodded slowly. A second later, he leaned in toward someone else, repeating what she had said. The words shifted slightly with each retelling, like a phrase being translated through several languages, but the point stayed the same. Something about the woman's posture, her training, the smoothness of her movements. None of it fit with the quiet, reserved neighbor people thought they knew. The idea that she had a military background didn't feel far-fetched. In fact, once the suggestion surfaced, it felt almost obvious. Across the yard, another neighbor overheard the murmurs and added his own recollection. He mentioned seeing her at the hardware store months earlier, where she had studied a display of ropes and carabiners with the kind of focus people use when they know exactly what they're looking for. He had joked with the cashier at the time, wondering what someone so quiet could possibly need climbing gear for. Now he replayed that moment in his head with a completely different understanding. The man still held in her control began to hear pieces of the whispers too. At first, he thought people were just talking about him, mocking him for getting caught in such an embarrassing hold. But then he caught the tone of the words. He couldn't make out all of them, but he heard enough. Training, discipline, service, special operations. He tried to laugh it off as he shifted his weight, but the laugh came out thin and shaky. His friend heard it too. He stiffened and stepped back, forcing a bit more space between himself and the woman. His face tightened as he tried to deny what he was hearing, but denial wasn't convincing anyone. The precision of her movements had already told the story better than words could. There was no mistaking that level of control. It wasn't something someone picked up from a self-defense class at the local gym. It came from repetition under pressure. It came from instructors who didn't tolerate mistakes. It came from training meant to keep people alive. One of the older residents, a retired Marine, watched her with a knowing expression. He didn't join in the whispers. He didn't need to. He had recognized her bearing the moment she turned her head after the shove. He could see the quiet alertness in her eyes, the controlled breathing, the balance in her stance. He had met people like her before. Not many, because the community she had belonged to was small and selective, but enough to know what he was looking at. He finally leaned toward the couple beside him and said a few low words. They reacted immediately, eyes widening at the revelation. The information didn't stay contained. It spread through the yard in quick, uneven waves. You could see the moment people understood. Their posture straightened. Their expressions changed. A kind of collective realization settled over the gathering. The woman who had been pushed wasn't just trained. She had been elite. The kind of elite most people only heard about in documentaries or read about in articles. Someone murmured the words Navy SEAL under their breath, and the reaction was instant. The men who shoved her went pale. They looked at each other with a kind of panic that didn't need explanation. They had picked the worst possible person to provoke, someone who had spent years mastering skills they didn't even understand. The friend swallowed hard, his Adam's apple shifting visibly. The man held in her grip seemed to deflate, as if the realization drained the fight right out of him. He didn't try to pull away again. He didn't puff himself up or pretend he had things under control. He stayed still because stillness suddenly felt like the safest option. The neighbors around them didn't gawk. They didn't cheer or scold. They simply watched with the respect that rises naturally when people recognize they're in the presence of someone who has been through more than she lets on. A few even stepped back slightly, not out of fear of her, but out of discomfort for the men who had picked the wrong target. The yard didn't fall silent, but the chatter softened in a way that made the space feel smaller, like everyone had been pulled into the same understanding. She didn't react to any of the murmurs. She didn't acknowledge the spreading realization or the shift in the crowd. Her expression stayed steady, her movements measured. She wasn't performing. She wasn't showing off a skill set. She was simply handling a problem the way she had been trained to handle countless difficult situations. Her background wasn't something she flaunted. It was something she carried quietly, only visible now because two men had been reckless enough to force it into the open. The neighborhood didn't forget what happened that afternoon. Even people who hadn't seen the shove directly ended up replaying it through the stories told later. Each version slightly different, but all carrying the same message. The lesson wasn't about fear or toughness, or even about her being a Navy SEAL. It was about understanding that you never really know who someone is, and you never assume weakness just because someone is quiet. Parents talked about it while packing up leftovers. They told their kids that respect isn't optional, and that acting like a bully can put you in situations you aren't prepared for. A few mothers admitted they felt a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. Relief because the woman had handled the incident without anyone getting hurt. Embarrassment because none of them had taken the time to know her beyond small waves at the mailbox. They realized they had filled the gaps with assumptions, and those assumptions hadn't come close to who she actually was. The teenagers in the neighborhood traded stories about the moment she moved. They described it like something out of a movie, but underneath the exaggeration was admiration. They respected how calm she stayed, how she didn't brag afterward or make the men feel smaller than they already did. Even they understood that real strength didn't need a spotlight. The men who caused the problem didn't handle the aftermath with the same ease. They tried leaving quietly, but quiet didn't erase what people had seen. One of them kept glancing over his shoulder as he walked away, as if expecting her to follow. The other left with his shoulders slightly hunched, not because she had hurt him, but because he realized how much he had misjudged the situation. They looked like people who suddenly understood the consequences of their own arrogance. In the days that followed, the story softened a bit as it spread, but the core stayed intact. Neighbors brought it up while collecting mail, watering plants, or rolling their trash cans to the curb. They laughed a little, not at her, but at the absurdity of the men thinking they could intimidate someone like her. The laughter carried a note of respect, though, not amusement. People talked about the way she handled everything without raising her voice. They pointed out how she kept things from escalating when most people would have reacted with anger. They remembered how she moved the man out of his own aggression with nothing but technique and composure. Kids who lived nearby began referring to her as the lady who could stop anybody, though she never encouraged the nickname. When she passed by on her morning runs, people greeted her differently, not with fear or distance, but with a deeper kind of acknowledgement. They asked how she was doing. They offered her coffee on cooler mornings. They didn't pry into her past, but they treated her with the respect she had earned long before moving into their neighborhood. What lasted wasn't the spectacle of the moment, but the reminder it left behind. The neighbors realized how easy it was to overlook people who kept to themselves. They saw how quickly some folks assumed that quiet meant fragile. The lesson sank in. Humility matters. You never know who someone is, what they've lived through, or what they're capable of handling with steadiness that comes from experience. Those who witnessed the shove remembered the exact sound of it. Those who saw her reaction remembered something else entirely. They remembered the silence that followed, the way she assessed the situation without a hint of panic, the way she stayed grounded. On warm evenings after the incident, people found themselves talking about her strength in a way that wasn't tied to her past, but to her character. They admired her restraint. They appreciated how she protected herself without humiliating anyone. They respected that she could have done more, but didn't. Even the ones who had barely noticed her before now understood that composure can be its own form of power. A few neighbors admitted quietly to each other that the moment had changed the way they saw confrontation in general. They talked about how she didn't meet aggression with more aggression. She didn't need to. She met it with control, awareness, and a calmness that seemed to reshape the entire atmosphere of the yard. They realized that losing your temper is easy, but staying steady in the face of disrespect is something learned through discipline and experience. People didn't frame her as a hero. They didn't turn her into a legend either. They simply held on to the memory of how she handled herself when others tried to push her down. The lesson lived in the way they spoke to each other afterward, the way they thought twice before assuming anything about anyone, the way they understood that strength isn't always loud. And whenever someone new moved into the neighborhood and asked about her, the older residents didn't share dramatic stories. They just said she was calm, capable, and someone you should treat with the same respect you'd want for yourself.